Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this lecture in the series sponsored by the Religious and Psychological Well-Being Project of the Center for the Study of Religion and Psychology at the Danielsen Institute of Boston University. I'm Robert Neville, director of the Danielsen Institute and of the project, which is generously funded by the Meta-Nexus Institute of the Templeton Foundation. Our distinguished speaker this evening is Dr. Hardin L.K. Coleman, Dean of the School of Education at Boston University. Dean Coleman is a graduate of Williams College in Western Massachusetts and holds the PhD in Counseling Psychology from Stanford University. Prior to his doctoral work, he spent a decade as a high school religion teacher in Quaker schools and taught English in Shanghai for a year. Since his PhD in 1992, and prior to his coming to Boston University this fall, Dean Coleman rose through the academic ranks in counseling psychology at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where he also fell into administration during the last years. His primary field of research is high school counseling, and his specialty is counseling ethnic minority students, whom he studies concerning their ways of coping with ethnic diversity. His interests are, among many things, first in the issues of adolescents and their families in diverse ethnic and cultural environments. Second, in how to counsel them. And third, in how to measure the effectiveness of counseling, particularly in situations of diversity. Dean Coleman has published many, many papers on these and related topics and has played many important roles in the development of his profession. Tonight, Dean Coleman will lecture on the intergenerational transmission of trauma and recovery, the African American case. Please welcome Hardin Coleman to Boston University as one of its deans and to our podium this evening as our lecturer. Dean Coleman.
Yeah, one would say I'm an overtrained dilettante, but we'll go on from there. I am from Philadelphia, which means that when I get anxious, my rate of speech will get very fast, and the volume, irregardless of the microphone, will get unbearable. And my wife's not here to say, turn it down or move along. So I would prefer, rather than waiting till the end, that if you have a question, comment, particularly if you disagree, if you think I'm so far in left field that even Willie Mays couldn't catch the ball, please jump in and share. So I want to talk about a process of learning that occurred while I was working with in the south side of Madison, Wisconsin, in an Afrocentric treatment center, where the population were multiple generationally abused African American families, and mostly led by the women, and trying to understand what we could do to break that cycle of trauma. So a lot of my thinking and this conversation comes out of that clinical moment and trying to get some understanding. So all of you who do clinical work, particularly with significantly challenged clients, know that the way that we can stay present in that work is try to understand it at some abstract level. And so I want to share with you some of the ideas that we use to work with the women, and some of the ideas that I've developed over that time. Essentially, what I want to give you today, this is my agenda, and that's to give a context for the intergenerational transmission of trauma. Because part of understanding the lives of these women is to understand what part wasn't their creation, what part did they acquire as a function of a multi-generational experience, and how can we understand how that history becomes present in our psychological lives. I use an ecological model, Brenner, and then I'll talk about intergenerational transmission, cultural coping patterns, and then the whole process of resilience. And then I want to apply those core concepts that I'm going to share in the African American case, which involves issues of psychological colonization, the cycle of pain, belief systems, and optimal psychology, which is a framework developed by Linda James Myers at The Ohio State University. And if we have time, or at another point, there's also a way to think about the same core principles and apply it to the first Native American case. So quickly, and I'll go through this quickly, and if there are questions, the ecological framework is this theory of interlocking relations. And I think that's what's so powerful about it. It's not an attempt to deconstruct and isolate disparate variables that are independent. It's really trying to understand how we exist in these powerful relationships, not just now in our families and our loved ones, but over generations, and how those relationships get translated over time. And so Bronfenbrenner will talk about the macro system, or the historical process, those metaphysical ideas that organize our social and political system. I had the good fortune to be on the Mall last Tuesday, and one of the experiences was not just that moment, not just this time, not just this context, but this sense that this was a new macro system in evolution, that we get to be at that moment. As I told people, I didn't go to Woodstock, I didn't serve in Vietnam, and I never saw the Stones or the Beatles, though I did see James Brown and the Temptations, so I think that worked out. But I wanted to be at that moment when you see history shift and occur, and what that means to us. And I think many of us will talk about a psychological shift that event occurred. Then the next level is the exosystem, with the institutions, which operationalize those social political systems, and how do we think about that? And then finally, the relationship between institutions, and how that is part of our lives. And then the relationship between and among people who live in those institutions, who are part of that macro system. And how do we think about that in the generational sense? This is just a quick model. And what I love about this model is, it's pre-1970, because church is still there. And I bring that up because for the populations with which I dealt with, or I'm thinking about, particularly lower income African-American families that are female-headed, they have friends, they have family, but the school and church changed so radically on them that those core institutions that support many of us and support many African-American families very often are the most fractured in the lives of these women, and not having those relationships as part of the ongoing and the repetition of the trauma, and then what that means in terms of their access to other parts of the systems was very powerful. So what do we mean by this intergenerational transmission of trauma and coping strategies, all right? There's some core concepts that I think are part of this. The first is that myths are generated about one's group's experiences. And these myths, and when I use the word myths, I'm not talking about these ideas or these make-believes or these stories that don't mean anything. These myths are powerful ways to understand our historical experiences and who we are, and how that transmits into our sense of self in our lifetimes. Then those myths get institutionalized. Those beliefs about who and what we are and how that comes historically then get represented in institutions. And part of the shift last Tuesday is, as we hear time and time again, for the first time beyond our expectation, an African descendant person would live in the house that their forebears, not necessarily his, but people who look like him, built, that weren't allowed in, and how that's a powerful shift in the myth and the message and what that means to us. But the fact that we've grown up so long with this powerful idea that this was not a place where people who are African descendant belong, it's a powerful sense of who we are and what we are to us, that shift. And then the trauma that those myths sometimes represent gets replicated within our current interpersonal system. And that's how it gets translated over generations and over time. The mechanisms for that transmission are the way we cope with our culture, that we all have strategies for managing coping with our current culture, and those are mechanisms by which this trauma gets reproduced and expressed. Then the familial coping strategies, how we manage this in the families, what we tell our children what they can be, how we treat them, the expectations we hold for them are part of the replication of the myths. and then our own personal experience within these institutional frameworks are all part of the mechanisms that draw. I know for me, there's been this ongoing sense of falsehood that has dominated my professional life. And every time I would walk out of a building, University of Wisconsin-Madison, I would be worried. And it doesn't matter whether anyone was actually thinking about it. The issue is I would be worried that I was seen as this affirmative action hire. Right? Whatever success I had in the world, that I would be seen as this affirmative action hire. That why would I think that I had any aspirations over a chauffeur? And that people would look at me from this perspective. Now, where does the chauffeur come from? My father was a straight A student in the 1930s in Philadelphia. When he went to his guidance counselor in 10th grade, she said, "Bill, you're bright, you're articulate. You'll make someone a good chauffeur one day." Because that is the myth of the height of economic aspirations, certainly for my father, and we all had these stories, right? We all had these stories in different ways, whether it's gendered, whether it's race, whether it's ethnicity, whether it's religion. We all had these stories, but that's how these get replicated over time. So one way I like to think about this is within what Slavin et al. Developed is this theory of the multicultural model of stress process. And for those of you familiar with Lazarus' original model, which suggests that that stress is not something doesn't cause stress. There's some intellectual or cognitive mediating events. So a stressful event occurs, or an event occurs, that your primary appraisal is that that's stressful, right? That the event happens and you decide that's stress. Okay, when I go walking the dogs at night, and it's dark, and I hear footsteps behind me, right? And it's dark, it's at night, it's an area that I'm not familiar with, and I hear footsteps, I go into my stress mode. Because my primary appraisal is I don't know what's behind me. I don't know what is occurring. And I always find a very subtle way, because I don't want to turn around and look at everyone like, oh, I'm scared of you, to find out how far and how close it is, because that is what makes it stressful. Not the footsteps, because it could happen during the day, it could happen in a different part of town that I would not then appraise that as stressful. And then there's a secondary appraisal, okay? It's stressful. Is it really going to affect me? And do I have the ability to cope and manage with that? Finally, what am I going to do? All right, so I have a fairly part of it's gendered. No one's going to take me. I'm walking the dog at night. I'm okay, and I have all these idiot testosterone-driven ideas about my ability to cope any situation, right? And then finally, I adapt to that stress. So what do? You make sure you're walking where it's light. You try to pick a time of day when you think there are other people around. There are all sorts of things we do to adapt. And that's kind of the general Lazarus model. The cultural model is that there are events that occur. Walking out of your building at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, watching all these wonderful students come down the hill is not a universally stressful event for everybody. But when all those students, or almost all those students, are white, in the Midwest, my appraisal is I don't belong here. There's something out of it. So I give a cultural definition to that event. This taps into myths that I carry with me. And then I have to define my options. All right? I define my options. I was not allowed in downtown Philadelphia without a coat and tie on until I was in high school, because I may see one of my father's law partners. Now, my best friend, growing up in my neighborhood, father was also a partner in this firm, but he was white. In fact, his family owned the Wall Street Journal, so I don't think anything stressed him out, right? And he could go downtown without a coat and tie anytime he wanted to, because there was none of this cultural definition. My father grew up saying, never be further than a block away from your house without a tie on. Because if you're a colored boy in Philadelphia, that puts you at risk. And so now I was not personally at risk, but in my father's mind, his definition of being away from your family home, one block, puts you at risk as a function of your color. Not your economic status, not your friends group, but just purely that was a cultural definition, which then made leaving home a stressful event. How do you represent? How do you act? Then finally, culturally specific coping patterns, right? It'll be a long time before I don't wear a tie to work. I'm new here. I got over it in Wisconsin, but it'll be a time. But a lot of people are ties to work here, so I don't know how long I'll get there. But there's this whole issue. This is how you look, and there's nothing in my framework. Now I have a fairly significant history of stress. I went to okay colleges, just okay, all right, and pretty good graduate schools. But I still have a sense that am I the other? What does it mean? How do I represent when I walk into a room? So I was talking to a female dean the other day, who we were talking about getting we're all new deans, our class together, and she goes, well, we got all the women deans get together, so I'll organize that. You get together with these others. Because when I walked in, the first time I walked into the dean's meeting here, all the women were sitting here, all the men were around the table, and there was one empty seat. Now, many people wouldn't notice that, but it meant the only colored person in the room, there was a seat waiting, sitting between the white men and the white women. Now, that appraisal made that stressful for me. That is something that I have to understand, that I have to work with, which heightens my sense and then forces me into an adaptation, all right? Now, being a good psychologist, I talk about it, right? And I get my therapist is really wealthy in my time that I spend with him. I have all sorts of ways of managing that stress, but that's an ongoing issue. So whatever the normal stress pattern is often created by who and what we are. And we inherit these ways of managing those. When one comes from a threatened class, whatever threatened class you want to identify, it creates this set of risk factors, and I won't go through the whole history of what risk factors are for African Americans specifically. I will give some examples. The primary risk factors set people up to fail, right? So, and we have a long history in the United States as a function of being a member of the African American class, not taking full advantage of the society, not succeeding at the same rates that our other ethnic group peers do. So just by being African American, particularly African American and male in this society, puts you at a substantial risk factor, right? So my talk tomorrow night in the class on the miseducation of black boys is about this phenomena. The disparities in education, the disparities in income, the disparities in health that are significant to particular groups of people put people at risk. The question, when you start thinking about the intergenerational transmission of trauma, are what are those factors that help people overcome those risk factors? So when we talk about therapy, when we talk about treatment, the issue becomes how do we take what we know about these risk factors and how do we how do we help people redefine or better yet, use those strengths within their cultural frame of reference that allows them to overcome risk and multiply those more in their life. So the other part of this conversation is the story of resilience. So how do we think about a case? When you want to think about a case of intergenerational transmission of trauma, what are the elements that make a case? And I think there are four. First, there's an original traumatic event. There's a signal traumatic event that is applied somewhat indiscriminately to all members of that group in a way that just by being a member of that group, you become subject to both originally and over time. So there's that traumatic event with particular negative outcomes that then get institutionalized over time, that those outcomes become institutionalized. Then one develops cultural coping strategies to manage that trauma. That the cultural coping strategies that a group develops is not necessarily about their strengths, but to manage that traumatic event as a shared generationally. And then finally, and this is the most psychologically disturbing, is the personalization of the trauma. That somehow, as a member of that particular group, I deserve. At which point, one begins to replicate the trauma on themselves. So anyone who does any work with abused women know this story powerfully, right? This is the issue that keeps particularly abused women, particularly in situations where their economic well-being is dependent on the other gender, keeps them in abusive situations. So the African American case is understood in slavery. right? It's a powerful traumatic event, the classic traumatic event that led to a process that Linda James Myers and many others call psychological colonization. And here's how it worked in this case. The first thing you do is make this group dependent. So any story, any understanding of the Middle Passage is about creating this trauma. So if you think through the process, it wasn't just being captured in Africa and being sold as a slave, because slavery throughout much of the world is a time-honored practice. And slavery through much of the world often ends up with the ability of the slave being able to buy their freedom eventually, or to be brought in as a member of the slaveholding class. What was unique and powerful about the American slave experience is that there was nothing that was about allowing the slave to then take on any form of equal role. And the whole process from the Middle Passage on was to make the people dependent by terrorizing and controlling all aspects of food and shelter. Right? Now, the next step is to distort the reality. Now, one of the things I like to pause and think about is we need to understand who were the agents of this terror. Now, this was not necessarily a group of the large architects, certainly the ship owners and the people who were involved in the cotton trade and the not wanting to go back to the United States empty and involved in the slave trade, the shippers. But most of this was produced by adolescent or barely adolescents, young, undereducated white males from the rural parts of England and Scotland and Ireland. So you think of it wasn't necessarily the slave owners, but the foremen were people who were undereducated, who were given a significant responsibility to manage a particular class where all the ideology associated with that class was to dehumanize them, right? I mean, we have the long literature of what people would think about slaves and what the general approach to slaves is not fully African Americans, only being 3/5 human. We all know the stories. But think about the people who were responsible were in a very dangerous situation where they were dependent upon terrorizing a group of people and then engaged in a series of actions that were totally meant to destroy the will of the individuals to resist their characterization, which is a powerful, traumatic event. And think of all the things we know, that you couldn't own your children, that you weren't allowed, that you didn't own your children, that anyone was allowed to your body for any reason whatsoever, that one of the things you would do is separate families, that whenever you picked out someone who was actually showing some degree of resistance, they would be the ones that you hurt the most, right? Then, to turn around and distort who they were, to tell them that they had no language, that they had no culture, that they weren't allowed to share their native languages, to develop their own religions, right? I mean, we know this is the process from the Middle Passage to the early slave conditions, and ultimately to deny the person's culture, to say, you have no culture except that which I afford you, is all part of the process of psychological colonization. Forbidding the language, religion, and then again, distorting the reality. And you deserve this. That somehow, given your state of being and who you are, this is the deserved process. Right? Now, you can only vaguely imagine the level of daily violence that must have been part of the ongoing slave trade. And we know it was much, much worse in the West Indies. Right? And the West Indies, they were much more sophisticated at creating a middle-colored mulatto class rather than using the Irish and the Scottish rural foremen in the West Indies. They created a colored class as agents of the oppression. And the brutality, the fact that people were completely interchangeable. And what does that mean to look around the world and understand oneself purely as an object? And that one's parents have no power to take care of you, preserve you, or protect you, and then somehow be convinced that you deserve that. Right? There's a powerful psychological process that negated, told you wrong, And then, having taken away all culture, this process of substituting one's own cultural framework with that of your oppressors, which is really the powerful and unique and perspective that would be characteristic of the American slave experience. The language, the religion, the creative expression, these were all that which was allowed to you, down to your religious practice, even though people would slip in and bring in historical African descendant practices, you wouldn't have the language for it. And you would be doing it within the context of the oppressor's culture. So your oppressor's culture becomes your own. And now you become this second-class citizen in a culture that is giving you no access to power, right, except through them. And the more competent you become in that culture, the more competent you become. So when I put on my button-down shirt and my tie and my blazer in the morning, there's a part of me that is replicating that process every day. Now, it's to belong, to be there, but there's a part of me that feels my membership in the economic wherewithal is to be able to identify with my language, my background, my training with this culture that would oppress people like myself. And so you imagine this ongoing psychological dilemma about how do I make this me? How do I make this real? What do I do about this? Right? And so somehow that's an ongoing part. And I have resources, right, to manage that. So these are just pictures of when we want to get depressed, you always look at pictures of the Middle Passage and how awful that experience was. And remember, these are who survived the Middle Passage, right? The elderly, the wise, didn't survive. And the young, really young, didn't survive. So even the group that was brought into the United States to recreate their own relationships were also young adolescents who had no sense of perspective in history. So you have these two adolescent cultures kind of interacting with each other in a very, as we know, devastating way. So, given that, one can make the argument that one of the issues addressing many, many African Americans is some form of post-traumatic stress. Certainly, those who survived and managed slavery were constantly experiencing this process of post-traumatic stress syndrome. So I'll just quickly go through for those, I know many people may be familiar with it. So traumatic event is persistently re-experienced in one of the following ways. Either through recurrent and distressing thoughts and recollections, recurring distressing dreams, acting or feeling as if the traumatic event is recurring, and intense psychological stress due to exposure, internal and external causes in terms of managing. So go back to the Lazarus model of stress, that to trigger this sense of trauma is very easy. It doesn't take a lot to get one's thinking of one's otherdom and how one learns to manage that. So how one copes with that ongoing trauma is phenomenal, and then the physiological reaction. So again, trauma has been exposed to a traumatic event and the ongoing. All right. Now, one of the things that people do in facing the ongoing trauma is this process of avoidance. So one of the things is we work with women, particularly as these traumatic, violent events get replicated in their daily life, is to think about how we can avoid anything associated with the trauma. So we want to avoid thoughts and feelings, people, place, and things. So there's an attempt to withdraw from the stimulus. And when you think about what for poor African-American families, the American school system is as a constant reminder of one's status. And I'm going to make the argument, it doesn't matter what the ethnic background of the teachers teaching you, the structure of American schools is a reminder of a European structure and rhythm and lexicon that every day one has to come to grips with how do I belong or not belong. And withdrawal from that trauma is when you don't have the scaffolding support to help overcome it, is a persistent experience. So what do people have? Difficulty falling asleep, irritability and outburst of anger, difficulty concentrating, hypervigilance, exaggerated response. Now you think of kids who spend time in American schools who are hypervigilant, exhausted, worried, and how they maintain themselves in schools. You start thinking about what that school experience is like. So I was over at if you go over to the Trotter School, which is the school in Dorchester, Roxbury, with which we have a direct relationship, and the principal is going to just say most of her kids are experiencing trauma, that at one level significantly traumatized. And we're asking them to come into a structure that is not set up to manage these persistent symptoms, right? What do we want to teach a second grade, third grade boy to do? Sit still, be quiet, pay attention. When that very act of being in the room is one that they're not prepared for. It's not the way in which their family manages them. It's a very different lexicon, and we're asking them to pay attention to academic content. And we're surprised when they don't succeed. And because very little of the work we do is structured around addressing these core trauma. So one of the things that when we work with the women in this program is to understand what we call the cycle of pain. And this is a powerful process where one of the coping mechanisms is to start to deny one's sense of physical self. The whole part of trauma is to repress it, to deny it, to try to avoid it. But there's these awful feelings inside that build up. This is a hydraulic model of stress almost, where it builds up to the point of disassociation. And when you watch the patterns in these women's lives, there's this pattern of quiescence where they seem calm, they seem present, but you can feel as you work with them over time this building anger. And their experience is they get to this moment of buildup of pain where something has to happen to allow them to release that pain. Common practices for releasing that pain is alcohol and drugs, or acting out in relationships that tend to be violent. At which point you have this phenomenal release, whether it's through getting high, and as we know, once one is in high on drugs or alcohol, the likelihood of being subject to abuse goes up. I mean, one of the most scariest events that, in fact, once a woman's been raped once, she's more likely to be raped again than a woman who's not been raped. Right? Because the whole sense of how you order the world's been so severely traumatized and disordered, you lose the kind of signals that you had before that boundary violation to manage the world. And now we have a population that's already disordered, has not have been told that their boundaries are safe to begin with. When they engage in these behaviors, it gets worse. So you have this dissociative moment, you release, and then just keeps going back. So the coping mechanisms that these women learn over time do not serve to break the cycle of pain. And it came home to me when we were doing this intake with this 15-year-old girl. And she described her life from 8 to 13, 14, where she was what we would refer to as a feral child in Chicago, where her mother engaged her in a ring of prostitution starting at 8. So her mother was used her body to make a living. She then would go from abandoned house to abandoned house, getting all her physical and emotional and support using her body, until she fell in with this older gentleman when she was around 12, 13, who was actually relatively non-abusive and would care for her, and building of a stable relationship till she was 15, at which point her mother came back in the relationship and snaked the man from her daughter. Right? Now, what stunned us about this story was the lack of affect this girl described in sharing it. That we're sitting there, our eyes are getting bigger, we're feeling badly for, we're trying to be empathic. For her, this was a description of her life, and it was common, it was expected. And that level of disowning your self-value is part of this deep-seated trauma That then one can imagine, having been treated like an object all her life, how is she going to manage that moment of child rearing except to see her children as also objects of good or bad objects in her life? And that kind of interpersonal I-thou moment that we all seek in our relationship, particularly with our children, is forever to some degree lost to her. So, what do you do? Right? Now, this is the other piece of the story. Because the key to doing therapy in this situation is a deep-seated belief that somewhere there's a place of connection and it's subject to subject. Somewhere deep there's this potential connection, and that it's the role of the therapist in the treatment facility to reach this moment where you can begin to engage people at an interpersonal caring level that helps them develop models alternate to the ones they've grown up with. So that's key to the therapeutic theory and belief. And one way to address that, and we believe that one can't do that without also addressing the psychological and cultural factors relevant to that trauma. Now, I'm going to be the first one to say I have no idea if this is true. But at the practice level, we chose to focus on a theory of Afrocentric beliefs as a way of helping women, these particularly the women and their families, reorient themselves, a sense of themselves, to give them a sense of their physical selves as having some powerful, positive value that we suggested had historical roots. That as they could align with those values, those Afrocentric beliefs, and then begin to apply them into their daily lives, we were seeking change at multiple levels, both at the interpersonal, in terms of our relationship, but also at that metaphysical theory of self. Because if you go through American classrooms, how many of you remember, maybe this is a different generation, but certainly in my generation, in my childhood, growing up in Philadelphia, going to Quaker schools, I can't remember very many powerful and positive image of African Americans shared with me. Right? Now, so I was in my teenage years when Martin Luther King came along. Who else was a model? Outside of my personal family, what were the models of African American strength and belief and resilience that we were afforded as part of our American culture? And you go into American classrooms by and large, even today, besides sometimes the obligatory Martin Luther King, and depending on how black the school is, you'll get a Malcolm X. And now Obama, it's really cool to go to the Trotter to see they had his, I went up the day after election and they had Obama's picture all over. But it's just really a powerful moment. But most African Americans of my age, and I think younger, very rarely go to schools where there's a positive image of African American that's projected in schools, let alone what we see on TV. So you're very dependent on the nature of your family to present these positive images. So one of the things that we felt our responsibility to do was to suggest an idea about an Afrocentric way of being and thinking for these women that was an alternative to the thought processes that they've been raised in school. And I'll describe that in a little bit, but we found the powerful is to suggest that those who grow up in an Afrocentric worldview have a very different perspective than those who grew up in what we called, in this, it was incredibly racist, a suboptimal worldview. Right? And as I walk through it, you'll get to see who we called suboptimal, but we'll guess. And an Afrocentric worldview is valuing this focus on act and knowing as an intuitive experience. That one's awareness of the world was not a function of how many facts, wasn't a function of linear processing, but a function of bringing in the world as a direct phenomena without filtering. And that core to the Afrocentric belief system is this sense that we know what we experience. And there's a phrase, my personal phrase, we good 'cause you be. Right? Just 'cause you be, you're good. I'm trying to get this gentleman, Shiroka Holly, to come out, who's done a lot of work. He's the first person who talked about ebonics in a way that convinced me that there's anything useful in that conversation. And what he argued, he can identify the linguistics, but what he argues for is that it's a language for African Americans who grew up in a predominantly African American setting. There's a whole language and way of being that is genuine and authentic, and it's a language that as you honor it, you get kids to really learn grammar, because there is a grammar there. And it's the same process here. There's a thought process, it's a way of being that if one spends time within a predominantly African-American environment, you begin to see that it operates on an ongoing basis. For example, at the religious level, there's an essential forgiveness. Most African-oriented churches have a powerful and high standard for behavior and a belief that no matter what you did yesterday, you can be saved and have it again. And that sin is not something you carry within you on an ongoing basis. It's something that you can be saved from daily. And that process of forgiveness, of reacceptance, is core to much of the African American experience. So here's some of the beliefs. So, I admit to the racialized nature of this conversation between the optimal and the suboptimal. But the nature of reality is that the spiritual and the material are one. These aren't separate events. They're singular. So the drive to separate them become ego-dystonic. So you can see how someone invested in these beliefs would struggle with some of the structure of American classrooms. Versus materials possible with spiritual aspects, but they're separate and the spiritual is secondary, not primary. The nature of knowledge, that self-knowledge through symbolic imagery and rhythm. That you learn yourself through symbols and imagery and through rhythm versus this external knowledge. You don't learn externally and then apply it to yourself. It's something you come to directly. Logic, and it goes down. My favorite, again, is the identity. It's multidimensional. It's intrinsic to your being. Just because you are, you're powerfully good. Then how do you apply that in the world? And how do you bring that to the world? So one of the things, and they go on. I won't bore you by going through all those. But then what I want to talk about is how we translate that into the therapeutic moment. What we would have women do, and the first thing we did with these women was ask them, how many generations from slavery are you? How do you go back? What's your line? Can you sit down and think about your family? Now, given the nature of many of these women's lives, it's a very difficult event. And so to take the time, and something that very few people ask them, how far do you go back? When do you know there was a slave in your family? Right? How do you know that existence? So that's one question. To get them thinking that we value their history, which is something that was a rare event for many lower-income African-American families. Then the second question we begin to ask is, who was the traditional woman in your neighborhood? Somewhere in your life, somewhere in your world, there was a woman who represented these ideals. Often you call her auntie, or she was the woman that when anything was going wrong in the neighborhood, that was the kitchen to where you went for some sense of safety, security. The woman that when she walked the streets and if she said something, she was the woman that everybody, even the men, would begrudgingly ally themselves with. Right? That there was a real power there because part of the African American experience is through these matrilineal lines. Right? And because because from slavery, that was the adult who most likely was allowed to hold the family together. Right? And that was a role that becomes very powerful. And oppressive. I mean, I understand that as I look around the room, I know people know there's also an oppressive role, but it was a very powerful, important role. So we were asking the women to say, who was that woman in your life? And then what was she like? And what does she think? Because we're looking for whom can you use, to whom you can identify as a coping model to manage and rethink the way you do your life. At which point, once we've identified how many years from slavery, what are your stories, Who were the women growing up that you saw as strength? Now, what would they do in this situation? What would they do with this child? How would they handle it? And this ongoing powerful experience of getting people to think about their positive role models and think about, okay, which of these beliefs are you using, all right? Which of the beliefs? Are you thinking in an optimal sense or a suboptimal sense? And whether it was right or wrong, what we found is it gave women a pause for looking for that positive image of self to allow them to begin to think of a different way of being. And we believed, and not consistently, not everyone joined in, but we believed that would help break the transmission of trauma. So these are ideas they carried with them. So that's the African American case. I think it's a good time to pause, and no one interrupted me. You're all good, well behaved. You know, my family never lets me talk this long. So any questions? Or do you want me to walk through the other case?
If you have a question, please wait for the microphone. We are recording this.
I'm very curious how you were able to talk with your clients about the theory, because I understand the idea is great. It really makes sense. But how did you communicate the theory to them in a way that it would make sense to them and they could apply it?
Just like I have now. We walk through the process of psychological colonization. We had the structure of the program is that after the initial intake, with clinical intake looked like most every other clinical intake you ever had before, we asked some of the Afrocentric questions, but it's pretty much common. And then we'd have a mother's group. We'd start with we call it the starters group, and then we would teach them this conversation. What was the traumatic event? What's psychological colonization? What's the cycle of pain? And have them apply, give examples from their life, and then move into the belief system. These are the beliefs. What do you think? Go back and forth. Does it make sense? And that would be about 10 weeks. And then we move into what we call the moms group, at which point it would be much more, now how are you applying these beliefs in your idea? So it was a very explicitly psychoeducational, very patient, a lot of short stories, a lot of reading, a lot of bringing family issues in. So it was really, we taught first, which then allowed, we felt, some distance. Right? We all know if you go, the therapist is working you, right? And that's the common experience, a psychodynamic interpretation or behavioral interpretation. But we were able to not necessarily talk about what they had to do differently, but how are you thinking about who you are in your world? And then we had a similar thing for adolescents. We had an adolescent group, and we had every once in a while we get a dad in there. Every once in a while, that was, and I always got them. So.
Hi. I was wondering when you would ask the women to trace back their families to see how far back they could go. As I think about that question, I'm imagining that many of them might not be able to go very far back. And so the question in and of itself is a little disorganizing for them. And I'm wondering, when that happened, how did you handle that?
Well, our feeling was that would happen, because there would be some people in the group who could do it, some people didn't. But the being asked and thinking about it, and then for them, they would often then go and maybe find someone else in their family who may know more. Because one of the things that oftentimes people have in the family would be someone in their broader family who may know more, which then facilitate the connections. We were very supportive. And you're right, there were some people for whom this was a disorganizing event, but that was, we felt that it was more powerful being asked and being thought to think about it, and hearing other stories was then something people could use as theirs, as part of their story. So we found over time it was not as disorganizing or discomforting as it was a positive effect. Though there were, people who didn't come back. I mean, and how do you know? That may have been the question.
This is probably a strange question, and I'm trying to find the way to formulate it.
Put it out there.
I was curious about therapy being a Western cultural product, and to what degree is the participation in therapy colonizing? And to what degree is this competing with the retrieval of Afrocentric values?
It's a great question. We were working within a Medicare, Medicaid system, and so this was the accessible treatment. We were in a house, right next to the church, one of the dominant African-American churches in the town. It was a joint program started by the church and the mental health center, established by a finding among, it was originally, the program was started by finding that in Madison, Wisconsin, as in much of the world, when white kids got caught doing something wrong, they got referred to therapy. When black kids got caught, they got referred to jail. And given that, the feeling was, well, where you go? Because the therapy was truly going to the mental health center, going to private therapy, going into a room, and there was no cultural specificity. So what we were trying to do was surround them, the clients, in areas that were more familiar in their neighborhood. They could walk, or they knew people who lived in the area, and increase the sense of familiarity. And literally, it was a building. It was a house with the bathroom and the kitchen and living room, much like the homes that these women would be living in as well in their neighborhood, to reduce that sense of distance. And by and large, the staff were African-American women, and one of the most powerful members of the staff, for whom I learned a tremendous amount, had started as a client in the program. And her kids had gone through. So in that way, yes, it was westernized. Yes, it was reflective of a dominant Western modality, but then given that kind of culturally appropriate overlay. But it's the world in which we're living. I mean, it was not like we were bringing people from far away. Peter?
Hardin, I was interested, you talked about, I think it was a Dorchester school where all the students were, quote, traumatized. That was almost a given that the principal said.
Yeah.
I'm interested in your take on the KIPP schools now. Obama has held them up as a model, Gates, even the new Secretary of Education. And my sense is that the KIPP schools sort of reject the idea of trauma, or else they just say, well, it's a given, but through sort of a tough love approach, we will overcome it. Do you have any sense of the KIPP schools, why they're effective, maybe they're not?
Oh, I think that their data is very powerful, and they are being very effective with a broad range of ethnic groups and poor families, and going in and creating. And I'm going to give two ways I think that they're very powerful and effective. One, to some degree, culturally specific. One of the traditions in successful middle-class African-American families is a process called controlled decision-making, where if anyone spends any time around middle-class African-American families, you know there's someone who lays down the law, and you don't step over that line. And people are very clear what's expected out of you, in church, out of church, in the public, and this is what you do. So it's not, and you can see its roots in slavery, right? Because I can't protect you from the world, I will tell you what to do, and you do it, and I'm going to reinforce that. And there's a hierarchy here that the more you follow it, the more successful you will be. So there are rhythms, and you certainly see this in Latino families as well. So many of the cultural backgrounds of the families who come into KIPP schools are prepared for that structured, I'm here for you, right? And one of the things that happens in the KIPP schools is this unwavering belief, you're good because you be. Unwavering, you're here, I believe in you, and I'm going to do all I can to make you successful, which is a very different experience that many people get in your common in many public schools. So in some ways, they model some traditional Latin and African American familial practices and bring them in the classroom with a high level of expectations and huge amounts of scaffolding and support, huge amounts, long days, and pull these kids out of competing environments and keeping them in an adult-mediated moment for very long parts of the day. And if you don't make it, you don't make it. So so I think for the kids who get into a KIPP school, stay in a KIPP school, and get all the benefits, it's wonderful. It's hard for me to see how it's a scale-up model because of the resources and the commitment that both the families and the kids have to make to stay in them, which sometimes means leaving one's home. And That's a tough choice. So, I think the KIPS capture some traditional African American patterns, and they don't work for everyone. If it doesn't work for you, you're gone, because it's not a catchment school. Now, if they were successful, if they took a catchment area, they want to go to the Trotter School in Dorchester and say, this is my catchment, and I'm going to make sure that every kid in my catchment area is successful. I don't know any charter independent school who's done that. I don't know any. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. There may be people who know better, but most of the schools are choice, and they have the ability both to let go of teachers, which is a good thing, and kids. Is that a fair answer, Peter?
I was wondering if you could change focus for just a minute. A number of your comments and slides make sort of oblique reference to church, spirituality, religion. I wonder if you could just take a moment and reflect a little more explicitly on how you see that fitting into this process.
As an institution, the African American church, from very early on, has been a moment of independence. Even as it's been reflective of the oppression, it's been in a moment of independence from the actual oppressor. Right? So I don't know. I mean, how many people know the history of the Black church? How many? Enough. Okay. The predominant modality would be on Sunday, the owner would go to the white church, which then would allow some of the slaves would often go back in away from the houses, and initially would practice traditional West African rituals. As that was then further oppressed, they found that if they gave a Christian overlay to that process, some people were allowed to continue to speak. And there usually would be, and it was the only day you could go to another plantation. So sometimes it was the only time you could find members of your other family. Right? So families were shared and sold in a geographic area. Sundays were the day you could travel, and but you would do it under the guise often of the church. So it's where independent power developed over time. So it's no surprise that in the civil rights movement, when opportunity came for advancement and freedom, it came out of the Black church, because it was the independent institution, the only independent institution in African American lives, and covered, especially National Baptists and some Methodists would incorporate this sense, some of the Afrocentric ideals. I mean, a few of them. So my family is multiple generation Episcopalian, so they got away from that in Maryland, and I just found out recently, the things you learn later is that, this is one of these embarrassing moments, that my Episcopalian bishop, great-grandfather was a slave owner. I mean, he was Black, but he was a slave owner, because that was not uncommon in the northern Maryland, Virginia. Hopefully treated them a little bit better, but I can't count on that. But it was a place of independence throughout nationally. And so it becomes this institutional source of support. So if anyone was going to criticize the schools and get away with it, it'd be the church. If anyone was going to provide other resources, it would be the church. So it's the most mistake that Martin Luther King and his family grew up in the church. So that was a source, primary opportunity for effect and power. Is that a fair answer? So the spirituality, in the way we think of it as a independent of religion, is a little bit different. It's more the mythologies of self that are powerfully transmitted through the church and powerfully transmitted through these ideas, more than when we think of spirituality in terms of one's connection with the spirit, as those Quakers in the room would think about a lot.
Might you tell us a little bit more about how the belief system was derived?
Yeah.
You rather quickly said...
Yeah, Linda James Myers, who's a psychologist at the Ohio State University. Now I'm going to go, let me see if I all these names I haven't thought of in a little bit. So Linda James Meyer in 1988 wrote Understanding an Afrocentric Worldview and this Theory of Optimal Psychology. And I don't have on this reference list some of the other, probably starting about the mid-60s through the 70s and 80s, a group of thinkers who were trying to explore what are these Afrocentric ideas. So there's a series of books on the Afrocentric idea, Afrocentric ideas, Afrocentrism. I can get you the references. I'm sorry I didn't put them on. With this search for what were those ideas that were commonly held across broad groups of African-descended individuals in the United States that were so common that they could trace back to some particularly West African ideas. And so there was a substantive amount of philosophical and political and then some historical writing about that concept. Linda James Myers took that writing and suggested or hypothesized that this worldview, which is Afrocentric in origin, has a psychological outcome in terms of the beliefs and the behavioral sequela of that. And that's what she outlines. And she became that was the pattern that we use. As I said before, I'm not going to sit here and argue with anyone who's an advocate of empirically validated treatment and suggest that I know this is what, it was the ideas that counted. And was it the fact that the women who ran the group reflected the women who were there? Was it that it was, I don't know if you're familiar with Bruce Wampolt's work on common factors in psychotherapy, and he would argue that we created an ideation that they could relate to. I mean, it's Jerome Frank's work is this very similar. This is actually Jerome Frank's work, and Bruce Wampol's done the empirical support, meta-analytic support for this work. It's the ideas that people could share, and there are rituals for exploring the ideas, same pattern to those ideas that was consistently applied that would allow the women in relationship to the therapist experience a sense of relief and reduction of stress. That was the real therapeutic outcome. So it could, independent of the ideas, and they were just the mechanisms used, and giving a different language of cultural coping patterns.
Could you possibly go back to your previous slide with the that's it, yeah. I'm just somewhat puzzled, or at least interested in, let's say, logic. Union of opposites, both end, suboptimal, dividing into two. It would seem to me, for example, I'm not sure what this will exemplify, but how you doing? It would seem to me that in some sense, let us say, King's letter from Birmingham jail is a series of powerful distinctions. Not necessarily dividing into twos, but distinctions. Distinction between this and that, this and that. So that in a certain sense, one could imagine that therapeutically, in order to make whole, the derivation of the word from Greek, you may wish to distinguish, as Socrates did all the time, as Plato did all the time, in order to find the nature of X. So it seems to me that maybe at least, or at most, the belief system is a very impressive metaphysics, but each one of these things has, each side, so to speak, needs so much more theoretical power.
Pardon?
More theoretical power.
It needs more?
Needs,
Yeah.
needs, requires. Because philosophically, I'm not sure, as I just quickly indicated, the notion of oneness runs through the optimal. Union, oneness, one with, one. I'm not sure whether I'm prepared to say that an Afrocentric optimal system, metaphysics, needs to be so monistic or holistic. It's a query, it's not a challenge.
No, no mas. I mean, I'm not. I agree. The useful distinction that was drawn in therapy is this concept of both and. That, well, people would often ask, well, is it this or is it that? I mean, this is the intellectual struggle. Am I good or am I bad? That clients would often struggle with. Should, because I did this, it's bad, this would be good. And often we would help them resolve this. It's both and. It's not an either or dialectic, which is what I think a lot of, particularly clients struggling with PTSD, have a tendency to try to dichotomize their experience into black and white before and afterwards. And one of the things that we're working with is, no, you can bring this together. It's not either or, both and. And it was purely a linguistic ploy. I'll be the first one to admit that this is not a fully considered philosophical stance. It was a technique and ploy to involve the women, I think, effectively, but I don't think any of us would defend it on a fully considered philosophy. I mean, there are other writers who did a better job, I think, of addressing some of the issues you've read. But this, in terms of useful language, accessible language to the clientele, worked.
In point of fact, isn't this a suboptimal way of
Yeah.
characterizing the belief system?
Yeah. As I hope I suggested in my early approach to this, that I'm not going to die in this sword. I think there are problems with it, and I think it has some inherent racist overtones to it. But in terms of helping women who are deeply oppressed and deeply depressed, it was an effective way to get a language that they could start seeing themselves as having choices, which is, as you know, those of us who work in the therapy world, that is the biggest challenge, is to find someone to say, I have a choice. I don't know what choice I'm going to make, but I have a choice. And sometimes our language was used to facilitate that. I've always struggled with it. It's a system I inherited, but it made a lot of sense at its utility. So, Tom, did I say anything awfully embarrassing? And lots? Yes. Thank you. I'm done. I guess.
Join me in